Yesterday was supposed to be one of the happiest days of my life, my wedding day. Instead, it became a day marred by familial tension and emotional chaos. My father, the man I always imagined walking me down the aisle, had chosen a camping trip with my older brother over my wedding. It wasn't a last-minute decision or a misunderstanding. He'd made his priorities clear. So, as my small backyard ceremony unfolded, it was my stepdad, Mark, who took my father's place. He walked me down the aisle, a moment both sweet and bitter. Later that evening, after the celebrations had ended, my father showed up uninvited, crying and begging for a second ceremony. Now I'm left with a heavy heart, torn between anger and guilt. For some context, my fiancé, Ethan, and I got engaged about 5 months ago. We've been together for 4 years, and we wanted a small, intimate wedding in our backyard, surrounded by close family and friends. The date we chose wasn't random. It marked our 4th anniversary as a couple. Despite its simplicity, the event required careful planning, with decorators and caterers booked well in advance. Rescheduling wasn't feasible, but more importantly, I didn't want to. This day was meant to be ours, and I refused to let anyone derail it, not even my father. Last week, my dad called to tell me he couldn't attend the wedding. At first he cited a vague medical emergency, but I knew something didn't add up. When I pressed him, he finally admitted the truth. He had agreed to go on a camping trip with my brother Jake, and the dates overlapped with my wedding. Jake had planned the trip as a surprise, and my dad didn't want to miss out. Hearing this, I felt a mix of disbelief and disappointment. Jake and I have always had a strained relationship. He's 3 years older than me and has been the golden child our whole lives, an overachiever who could do no wrong in my dad's eyes. Meanwhile, I was the quieter, more ordinary kid, the one who often felt overshadowed. Growing up, Jake was insufferable, arrogant, entitled, and occasionally a bully. I envied him at times, but mostly I just resented how easily he commanded everyone's attention, especially our dad's. Our parents divorced when I was in middle school after my mom had an affair. It was a messy, bitter split, but not a surprising one. For as long as I can remember, my parents had a toxic relationship filled with fights and resentment. By the time the divorce happened, they were essentially strangers coexisting under the same roof. My mom's affair was the final straw, and while I didn't condone it, I also didn't blame her entirely. My dad had been drinking heavily during that period, which only exacerbated their problems. After the divorce, my dad got primary custody, though it was shared. My brother never forgave my mom for her infidelity, refusing to respond to her attempts to stay in touch. I, on the other hand, kept a relationship with her and her new husband, Mark. This decision further strained my relationship with my dad, who expected me to pick his side, as Jake had. Mark turned out to be a kind and supportive figure in my life, especially after my mom passed away from cancer 6 years ago. He helped me navigate that loss and has been a steady presence ever since. Despite our rocky history, my dad and I had been rebuilding our relationship over the past couple of years. With Jake living overseas, I finally felt like I had a chance to be seen and valued by my father. So when I asked him to walk me down the aisle and he agreed, I believed we had turned a corner. But his request to reschedule my wedding for a camping trip with Jake shattered that illusion. It was a painful reminder that I would never come first. When my dad confirmed he wouldn't attend, I made a decision in the heat of the moment. I called Mark and asked if he would walk me down the aisle. He hesitated at first, knowing my dad was supposed to do it, but ultimately agreed. It felt vindictive at the time, but I also felt justified. If my dad couldn't prioritize me on one of the most important days of my life, then I would lean on someone who had always been there for me. Yesterday, as Mark walked me down the aisle, I felt a mix of gratitude and sadness. The ceremony was beautiful, and Ethan and I were surrounded by love, but my dad's absence was a glaring void. I had one of my cousins take a photo of Mark and me walking together and send it to my dad. Hours later, he showed up at the reception unannounced, visibly upset. What followed was a tense exchange that left him in tears and me questioning whether I had been too harsh. I told him he had disappointed me deeply, and that his actions made it clear where I stood in his priorities. He begged for a second ceremony, a chance to make things right, but I refused. It wasn't about the ceremony. It was about the years of feeling second best, the countless times he chose Jake over me. His apologies felt hollow, and while his tears stirred some guilt in me, I couldn't ignore the pattern of his behavior. As he left, I felt a pang of regret, but also a sense of resolution. For once, I had stood up for myself, even if it meant hurting him. Now, as I sit here reflecting on the day, I'm left wondering if I'll ever truly forgive him, or if I even want to. Growing up, my relationship with my dad was always complicated, and this recent wedding fiasco feels like the culmination of years of unresolved issues. To understand why this hurts so much, I need to go back to the beginning and piece together how we got here. My parents' marriage wasn't exactly a fairy tale. I don't have a single memory of them being genuinely happy together. Even during family vacations or holidays, there was this underlying tension between them. They put on a facade for the sake of appearances, but behind closed doors, they barely spoke to each other. The fights were constant, sometimes loud and vicious, other times silent and cold. By the time I was old enough to understand what was going on, it was clear they were just coexisting, holding on for reasons I still don't fully understand. Maybe it was for Jake and me, or maybe they were just too stuck in their ways to walk away. When my mom's affair came to light, it was like a bomb had gone off in our lives. The divorce that followed was messy and bitter, but if I'm being honest, it wasn't entirely unexpected. The affair might have been shock, but the divorce? That was inevitable. My mom moved out and custody was split. Jake and I alternated weeks between our parents' homes, which was awkward and stressful. Jake, being Jake, made it clear where his loyalties lay. He refused to forgive my mom and actively avoided her while I tried to maintain some sort of relationship with her. This put me on the outs with my dad, who couldn't understand why I wasn't cutting her out of my life like Jake had. Jake and my dad always had a special bond. Even before the divorce, it was obvious to anyone paying attention. Jake was the star of the family, the high-achieving older son who excelled at everything he did. He was the one my dad bragged about at work, the one who could do no wrong. Meanwhile, I was just me. I wasn't bad at anything, but I wasn't exceptional either. I was just your average kid. And in a family that seemed to only value the extraordinary, that meant I was often overlooked. Jake thrived on the attention. He loved being the center of our dad's universe, and he made sure I knew it. He was arrogant and entitled, always talking down to me like I was beneath him. To this day, I don't think he realizes how much of a bully he was, or maybe he does and just doesn't care. Either way, I was relieved when he left for college, and even more so when he moved to London for work. His absence gave me a chance to have a relationship with my dad, one that wasn't overshadowed by Jake's constant need to be the favorite. After Jake left, things between my dad and me started to improve. It wasn't immediate. Years of resentment don't just vanish overnight, but slowly we found some common ground. He apologized for how distant he had been and for the ways he had failed me as a father. He admitted that he had always been more focused on Jake, and while he couldn't undo the past, he wanted to make an effort to be better. For a while, it felt like we were finally moving forward. Then came the wedding. When Ethan and I got engaged, I didn't hesitate to ask my dad to walk me down the aisle. It felt like a symbolic gesture, a way to acknowledge the progress we'd made. He agreed without hesitation, and for a moment I let myself believe that the past was behind us. But then Jake came back into the picture, and everything fell apart. Jake visits once a year, and every time he does, it's like the old dynamics snap back into place. My dad reverts to his role as Jake's biggest fan, and I become an afterthought. It's frustrating and hurtful, but I've learned to cope with it until this time. This time, my dad didn't just prioritize Jake, he outright dismissed me and my wedding. Asking me to reschedule the most important day of my life for a camping trip was a new low, even for him. When he told me he wouldn't be coming, I wasn't surprised. Hurt, yes. Angry, absolutely. But surprised? No. This was just another example of the pattern that had defined our relationship for as long as I could remember. And yet it still stung in a way I can't fully explain. Maybe because I had allowed myself to hope that things had changed, and that I had finally earned a place in his heart that wasn't conditional on Jake's absence. In the end, I asked Mark to walk me down the aisle. Mark has been a steady presence in my life ever since my mom passed away. He's not my biological father, But in many ways, he's been more of a dad to me than my own father ever was. He's the one who held me together when I lost my mom, the one who showed up for me when I needed him most. Asking him to step into my dad's shoes wasn't just an act of spite. It was a way to honor the role he's played in my life. As I walked down the aisle with Mark by my side, I felt a mix of emotions. There was happiness, of course, because I was marrying Ethan, the love of my life. But there was also sadness, a nagging sense of loss for the relationship with my dad that I'll probably never have. And when I sent him the photo of Mark and me, I wasn't trying to hurt him. I just wanted him to see what he was missing. When he showed up at the reception later that night, I didn't know what to expect. The tears, the apologies, the desperate plea for a second ceremony. It all felt too little, too late. I told him as much, and while I don't regret standing up for myself, I can't help but feel a pang of guilt for the pain I caused him. This is the story of my life, really. A constant push and pull between wanting my dad's love and acceptance, and knowing I'll never truly have it. After my dad's surprise appearance at the wedding reception and his emotional breakdown, I couldn't shake the mixture of guilt and frustration that lingered. Ethan tried to reassure me, reminding me that I had every right to be upset and to stand my ground. But it wasn't that simple. Family relationships are never that simple. The morning after the wedding, I sat down with a cup of coffee, scrolling through the countless photos our friends and family had shared from the event. Each picture brought back a flood of emotions. There were beautiful moments of joy and love, but my father's absence cast a long shadow over everything. Mark looked so proud walking me down the aisle, his hand steady on mine as we stepped forward. I couldn't have asked for a better stand-in. Yet there was a voice in my head whispering that this wasn't how it was supposed to be. That's when the texts and calls started coming in. My dad, clearly remorseful, had been trying to reach me since the night before. I ignored the first few messages, then the next few, until I finally opened one out of sheer curiosity. It was the same as the others, an apology, a plea for forgiveness, and a desperate request for another ceremony so he could make things right. The words might have been different each time, but the sentiment was the same. I wasn't ready to respond, so I put my phone down and tried to focus on packing for our honeymoon. Ethan and I had planned a week-long getaway to Hawaii, hoping to unwind and start this new chapter of our lives on a positive note. But even as I folded clothes into the suitcase, I couldn't stop replaying the events of the past few days in my head. The truth was, I didn't know how to feel. Part of me wanted to forgive my dad and move on. After all, he did show up in the end, even if it was late, and he did seem genuinely sorry. But another part of me couldn't forget the pattern of neglect and favoritism that had defined our relationship. This wasn't just about the wedding. It was about a lifetime of feeling like I was always second to Jake. Jake, of course, wasn't helping matters. He had stayed silent throughout the wedding drama, but the day after, he decided to insert himself into the situation in the most Jake way possible. He called me from an unfamiliar number, probably knowing I wouldn't pick it up if I recognized it, and launched into a self-righteous lecture about the importance of family. "You can't just cut Dad out of your life," he began, his tone already grating on my nerves. "He made a mistake, but you're being cruel by punishing him like this." I should have hung up right then, but something about Jake always managed to push my buttons, so I stayed on the line, letting him ramble about how my behavior was selfish and how I needed to apologize and make things right. The kicker came when he started blaming me for ruining the camping trip, claiming that my dad was miserable the entire time because of me. It was classic Jake, turning the situation around to make me the bad guy, and for once, I didn't hold back. "Are you serious right now?" I snapped. "You and Dad were the ones who made this mess. He chose your stupid camping trip over my wedding. What was I supposed to do? Smile and pretend it didn't hurt?" Jake's response was as infuriating as I expected. "You've always been jealous of me. That's what this is really about, isn't it?" I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it. "Jealous? Of you? Jake, you might have Dad wrapped around your finger, but the rest of us see you for what you are, a self-centered, emotionally stunted man-child." The argument escalated for a few more minutes before I finally hung up, feeling a mix of satisfaction and regret. I knew I shouldn't have let him get to me, but it was hard to keep cool when he was so infuriatingly smug. As I sat there, still fuming, Ethan walked in and gave me the kind of calm, steady support I've come to rely on. He didn't try to solve the problem or tell me what to do. He just listened, letting me vent until I'd gotten it all out. By the time I finished, I felt a little lighter. "You don't have to figure everything out right now," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Take the time you need. This is your decision, not anyone else's." He was right, of course. I didn't owe Jake or my dad anything. Not an explanation, not an apology, and certainly not a second ceremony. But I did owe it to myself to decide what kind of relationship I wanted with them moving forward. The next day, Ethan and I boarded our flight to Hawaii. For the first time in days, I felt a sense of relief. The ocean breeze, the warm sun, and the beauty of the islands were exactly what I needed to clear my head. I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't let my dad's mistakes or Jake's toxic behavior ruin this trip. This was about Ethan and me, about starting our life together, on the right foot. Still, even in paradise. My dad wasn't far from my thoughts. I knew I couldn't avoid him forever. At some point, I'd have to face him and figure out where we stood. But for now, I was content to let the waves carry my worries away, even if only for a little while. Hawaii was a dream. Ethan and I spent our days exploring the beaches, hiking trails, and soaking in the stunning sunsets. For the first time in weeks, I felt free from the stress of wedding planning, the suffocating weight of family drama, and the constant battle in my mind over whether I had done the right thing. It was exactly the kind of reset I needed. But as always, reality has a way of intruding when you least expect it. On the third morning of our honeymoon, my phone rang. The number wasn't familiar, but curiosity got the better of me, so I answered. "Big mistake. It was Jake. Before you hang up, just hear me out," he said quickly, his tone laced with that infuriating mix of entitlement and faux sincerity. "I'm not calling to fight," I sighed, already regretting picking up. "What do you want, Jake? Look, I know things are tense right now, but you can't just shut Dad out. He's miserable. He's been trying to make amends and you're ignoring him like some heartless—" "Stop right there." I cut him off, my patience already paper thin. "You don't get to guilt me into forgiving him. This isn't your business, Jake. It's between me and Dad." "That's the thing," he said, his voice rising. "It is my business. You're punishing him and it's affecting all of us. He's been a wreck since the wedding. You need to stop acting like a victim and—" "Jake," I interrupted, my voice firm. "I'm not punishing anyone. I'm setting boundaries. You wouldn't understand that because you've never had to. Dad has always treated you like a king, while the rest of us were just supposed to accept being second class. You might be okay with that, but I'm not." He sputtered, clearly taken aback. "This isn't about favoritism. You're just being petty. Dad loves you. He's always loved you." I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. "Really? Is that why he chose a camping trip over my wedding? Is that why he spent my entire childhood making me feel like I wasn't enough? If that's his version of love, I don't need it." Jake tried to argue, but I was done. "I'm on my honeymoon, Jake. This is the last time I'm talking about this with you. Stay out of it." I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking with a mix of anger and frustration. Ethan, who had been lounging nearby, looked up from his book. "Jake again?" "Yeah," I muttered, flopping down beside him. "He's trying to guilt-trip me into forgiving Dad." Ethan didn't say much. He rarely does when I'm venting. But the steady way he put his arm around me was all the comfort I needed. "You don't owe anyone forgiveness," he said simply, "especially not on their terms." That conversation with Jake cemented something I'd been mulling over since the wedding. I needed space, not just from Jake, but from my dad too. It wasn't about cutting them out of my life, it was about protecting my peace. For years I had bent over backward to keep the peace, to be the good daughter, the one who didn't rock the boat. But where had that gotten me? Hurt, overlooked, and constantly questioning my worth. It was time to put myself first. A few days later, as our honeymoon was winding down, I finally decided to respond to my dad's messages, not with an apology or an invitation to talk, just a clear request for space. I told him I had seen his messages and heard his apologies, but I needed time to process everything. I asked him to stop calling and texting for a while, explaining that constant reminders of what had happened weren't helping either of us. To my surprise, he didn't argue. When I finally mustered the courage to call him, he picked up almost immediately, his voice a mix of relief and apprehension. "Hi, Dad," I started, unsure of how to proceed. "I just wanted to say I got your messages and I know you're sorry, but I need some time. All of this, it's too fresh. I can't just move on like nothing happened." "I understand," he said quietly, his tone surprisingly subdued. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready." His response caught me off guard. I had expected more begging, more guilt-tripping, but instead there was a genuine softness in his words. Maybe he really did want to change. Or maybe he was just saying what he thought I wanted to hear. Either way, I wasn't ready to make that call yet. The next morning, Ethan and I packed our bags and headed back home, ready to leave the drama behind and focus on starting our life together. But as much as I tried to bury the past, I knew this wasn't over. Family issues don't just resolve themselves. They linger, waiting for the next opportunity to resurface. When we got home, life slowly began to settle back into its routine. Ethan went back to work, and I threw myself into my own projects, grateful for the distraction. But in the quiet moments, those rare lulls where my mind had room to wander, I found myself replaying conversations with my dad, analyzing every word, every decision. The hardest part was accepting that my dad's love might always come with conditions, that no matter how much progress we made, Jake would always be the golden child, and I would always have to fight for scraps of attention. It wasn't fair, but it was my reality. And while I wasn't ready to forgive him, I also wasn't ready to cut him out completely. Life is too short for that. For now, though, distance felt like the best solution. Maybe time apart would help us both gain some perspective. Maybe it wouldn't. But at least this time, I was choosing what was best for me. Coming back from the honeymoon felt like stepping into a different world. Ethan and I were married now, ready to take on life as a team, but the weight of everything with my dad still loomed over me. The house was quiet, and for the first time in weeks I had space to think. It wasn't easy to reflect on everything that had happened, but I knew I needed to. I couldn't keep carrying the emotional baggage of my dad's choices without deciding what to do next. The first few days home were uneventful. I stayed busy unpacking, catching up on work, and reconnecting with friends who had reached out to congratulate us. My dad had kept his promise not to contact me, which was a relief, but also left me feeling unsettled. The silence felt unnatural, as if we were both waiting for the other to make a move. I knew I would have to face him eventually, but I wasn't sure when or how. Then one evening, while Ethan was at work late, I decided it was time. I got in my car and drove to my dad's house. My heart pounded as I pulled into the driveway, unsure of what I was going to say. I hadn't told him I was coming, and I wasn't even sure he would be home. But as I walked up to the front door, I saw the familiar glow of the living room light and knew he was inside. When he opened the door and saw me standing there, he looked surprised but not unhappy. "Hey," he said softly, stepping aside to let me in. "Hi, Dad," I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. "Can we talk?" He nodded, motioning for me to sit on the couch. As we settled in, I noticed how tired he looked, his face lined with guilt and weariness. For a moment I felt a pang of sympathy, but I quickly pushed it aside. I had come here for answers, not to let him off the hook. "I need to be honest with you," I began, my hands gripping the edge of the couch cushion. "What happened with the wedding, it hurt. A lot. And it wasn't just about you missing it. It was about everything leading up to it. The years of feeling like I didn't matter as much as Jake. It felt like all of that came to a head when you chose a camping trip over my wedding." He looked down, his hands clasped tightly together. "I know," he said after a long pause. "And you're right. I messed up, badly. I don't have an excuse for it. I thought I could make it up to you, but I see now that some things can't be undone." I appreciated his honesty, but I wasn't ready to let him off the hook just yet. "This isn't just about one mistake, Dad. This is about a lifetime of feeling like I'm second best. Every time Jake comes back, it's like I disappear. You drop everything for him, and I'm left wondering why I'm never enough for you." He winced at my words, and for a moment, I thought he might start crying again. But instead, he looked me in the eye and said, "You're not second best, Emma. You've never been second best. I didn't know how to balance things. Jake needed me in ways you didn't, and I thought I was doing what was best for both of you. I see now that I was wrong. I see how much I've hurt you." Hearing him admit that felt like a weight lifting off my chest, but it wasn't enough to erase the years of pain. "I appreciate you saying that," I said, my voice softening slightly. "But words aren't enough. If you want a real relationship with me, you need to show me. You need to make an effort, even when it's not convenient for you, especially when it's not convenient." He nodded slowly, his expression serious. "I want that, Emma. I really do. I know I can't change the past, but I want to do better moving forward. If you'll give me the chance, I'll prove it to you." It wasn't an instant fix, but it was a start. I could see in his eyes that he was sincere, and for the first time in a long time I felt a glimmer of hope. "Okay," I said finally, "but it's going to take time. I need space to heal, and I need to see that you're willing to put in the work." "I understand," he said quietly. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here." Before I left, he asked if he could hug me. It was awkward at first, but as his arms wrapped around me, I felt a sense of comfort I hadn't realized I was missing. It wasn't perfect, but something. On the drive home, I thought about everything that had happened, how far we had come and how far we still had to go. I wasn't naive enough to think that one conversation could fix years of hurt, but it was a step in the right direction. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. When I got home, Ethan was waiting for me with a cup of tea and a quiet smile. "How did it go?" he asked, his voice full of gentle curiosity. "It went okay," I replied, settling into the couch beside him. We talked. He admitted he messed up and said he wants to make things right. I told him I need time, but I'm willing to give him a chance. Ethan nodded, his hand resting on mine. "That's a good start." And it was. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't easy, but it was a start. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was taking control of my own story, not letting my dad or Jake dictate how I felt or what I did. It was my life, my decisions, and my relationships, and as I sat there with Ethan, I realized that was enough. Story 2. Fiancé Pretended to Cheat on Me is the title of this tale. I reclaimed the ring and left. Before we begin the video, guys, I just noticed something strange. Currently, 82% of you are not subscribers. Why don't you click the subscribe button if you're already here and like the content? It only takes a second, costs nothing, and helps the channel expand so I can continue to share more of the tales you enjoy. Let quote S begin the video now. The OP begins by stating that she has been seeing a 26-year-old woman named Emma for a little more than 3 years. I believed that everything was going well. I knew she was on the same page as me since we had discussed marriage a few times over the years. I eventually decided it was time to pop the question after months of saving money. I wanted it to be something she would never forget. I meticulously prepared every aspect of the event. I reserved a resort beside the lake first. This was no ordinary resort. With individual accommodations, a stunning view, and a setup for elegant dinners by the sea, it was one of those destinations you see on Instagram trip pictures. It seemed worthwhile even if I had to spend a significant portion of my funds on it. I wanted to spend the rest of my life with this woman, and I was proposing to her. You know, go big or go home. Another significant item was the ring. Emma had previously indicated that she always saw a diamond solitaire in our conversation. Not too extravagant. Just elegant, she had said. I therefore looked for the ideal ring for weeks. I knew it was the one when I found it. She was exactly who I anticipated she would be. My mother actually started crying when I showed her the ring. My mother has always been sentimental. "This is ideal, Michael," she said. "She will be thrilled with it." In contrast, my father believed that I was insane for spending so much money. "Are you certain about this, son? You know, marriage isn't all diamond rings and sunsets. Traditional fatherly guidance." The proposal itself went extremely well. At twilight, I had arranged a quiet meal by the sea. The lake was sparkling in the twilight of the day's light, there were fairy lights, and there was mellow music playing in the background. I felt so anxious. My hands were shaking when I pulled out the ring, but when I got down on one knee and asked her to marry me, she looked at me with tears in her eyes and said yes. I don't think I've ever felt so pleased in my whole life. For a minute it felt like everything was wonderful. Afterward, Emma was over the moon. She couldn't stop gushing about how amazing the proposal was and how pleased she was. She contacted her folks as soon as we got back to the cottage. Her mom sobbed on the phone, adding, "We're very pleased for you too, Michael. Welcome to the family. That actually meant a lot to me." Her dad, who's generally a quiet person, even told me, "You did fine, son." It seemed like the beginning of something truly remarkable. The initial weeks following the proposal were amazing. Emma couldn't wait to show everyone her ring. She would say, "Look at this," to strangers like the grocery store clerk. "Isn't it beautiful?" To be honest, I didn't mind that my fiancé chose it for me. Seeing how content she was made me feel wonderful. Being able to bring her such joy filled me with pride. Our family were just as thrilled. My mother kept phoning me to inquire about the details of the wedding. She loves this type of thing since she is a huge planner. "Have you decided on a location yet? What hues are you considering? Oh, will you serve a plated meal or a buffet?" She was essentially prepared to assume responsibility for organizing our wedding. "Don't allow your mother take advantage of you," my dad, being my dad, said. "Keep in mind that this is your wedding, not hers." The same was true for Emma's family. Her younger brother made jokes about how he would one day be the cool uncle, and her mother began referring to her as the bride -be. At first, everything appeared to be going well, but Emma soon began acting strangely. It seemed subtle at first. She began spending more time with her pals. She explained to me that it was because she would have less time to spend with them after we were married. Now she wanted to take advantage of it. I didn't want to be the man who prevented her from enjoying herself with her friends, so that made sense. In addition, I trusted her, and her friends are good people. Then, however, minor things began to annoy me. Emma's sense of humor has always been peculiar. Her jokes, however, began to seem a little strange following the proposal. "Oh, I've got Michael trained so well, he'll do anything I ask," she would say. She repeated it a few times in front of her pals. And I felt strange while they were laughing. I didn't want to come out as excessively sensitive, so I initially dismissed it. I reasoned that it may be her method of coping with the pressures of wedding preparation. We had supper at her parents' place one evening. Everyone was laughing and chatting around the table at one of those large family dinners. I volunteered to help clean up after supper. "See, I've trained him well," Emma said. In fact, her father scowled and told Emma not to say that. It's not pleasant. I could see her dad didn't enjoy it either, so I chuckled awkwardly so as not to cause a scene. However, the remarks continued. Actually, when we went out with her pals, things grew worse. She would playfully flirt with her male acquaintances, saying things like, "I'd definitely date you if I wasn't engaged." And then she would glance at me as if I was expected to laugh. I didn't want to argue in front of everyone, even if it was embarrassing. On a few occasions, her friends even urged her to quit. "That's not funny, Emma," one of them said. You quote, being a little impolite. However, she would dismiss it with a simple, "Calm down, it's only a joke." I once mentioned it to her. I told her I felt uneasy about some of the things you say in front of your pals. "Are you unable to accomplish that?" "You need to learn to take a joke," she remarked, rolling her eyes. "Your seriousness is excessive." It continued to annoy me, but I dropped it since I didn't want to start a heated argument. I believe that in my heart, I was trying to tell myself that it wasn't a huge problem, but in reality, it was. In retrospect, I regret not speaking up sooner. At least I wouldn't have let it to fester, even if it might not have changed anything. I kept telling myself at the time that this was only a phase and that she was anxious about the future or worried out about the wedding. However, the woman I proposed to was beginning to feel alienated, and I was at a loss for what to do about it. Emma and I were still getting along well after the proposal, but I began to notice some changes in her conduct. Because, in her words, "Things are going to change after we're married." She told me she wanted to spend more time with her friends before to the wedding. At first, I didn't give it much thought. I wasn't going to be the one to prevent her from meeting her pals after all. I also trusted her, and her pals were laid back. However, I became irritated with her behavior while she was around them. She made minor jokes about me at first, for example, such as referring to me as her manslave in front of her pals. "Oh, don't worry, Michael will handle it," she would respond with a giggle. He always does. To avoid giving the impression that I couldn't handle a joke, I initially tried to chuckle along. However, it hurt more the more she said it. It didn't even appear to be that hilarious to her buddies. I could see they were uncomfortable, even if they occasionally laughed uncomfortably. 2. We once went to this downtown pub with her buddies. Before she began flirting with David, one of her male friends, everything was going well. "David, I would definitely be dating you right now if I weren't engaged," she continued to joke. She even gave him a wink. David murmured, "Emma, stop," with an ashamed expression. "That isn't cool." However, she simply chuckled and reassured him that it was a joke. I didn't want to cause a scene, so I kept quiet at the moment, but it really got to me. When we came home later that evening, I discussed it with her. "Some of the things you say in front of your friends make me uneasy, Emma," I added. "Like the time you flirted with David tonight. That wasn't acceptable." "You need to learn how to take a joke," she remarked, rolling her eyes. "You're always far too serious." I made an effort to clarify that it had nothing to do with being serious. Respect was at issue. She wouldn't have it, though. She dismissed me, claiming that I was exaggerating. I ignored it since I didn't want to get into a heated argument, but it kept bothering me. It wasn't limited to her pals either. It was among our families that she began to say the same things. We had supper at her parents' place one evening. With just her parents, her little brother and us. It was a really informal affair. I volunteered to help clean up after supper. Emma then says, "I've already trained him." "Don't talk like that, Emma," her father stated after glancing at her. "It's not pleasant." "She's just kidding," her mother remarked, laughing uneasily. However, I could see that neither her father nor I were amused. Jokes continued to get more intense. She began referring to me as hubby in a mocking manner. She asked me to get her a drink when we were out and about, and I said, "Thank you, hubby. You're the best." She didn't say that. She stated it that way, as if she were making fun of me. I had the impression that I was being made fun of in all of her jokes. Sarah, my sister, also observed it. At a family barbecue, she grabbed me away and asked, "Hey, how are you?" "Emma has been acting strangely recently." I was at a loss for words. I just said with a shrug, I believe she was anxious about the wedding. However, I felt in my heart that it was more than that. The camping excursion followed. We were asked to spend a weekend with Emma's family, who like going camping. My sister and dad also attended, so it seemed like a fantastic opportunity for our families to spend time together. At first, everything was fantastic. We gathered around the fire to prepare dinner, put up the tents, and shared tales. That was one of those evenings when you think that everything in life is easy and ideal. While we were all gathered around the campfire, Emma suddenly destroyed everything. "You know, I have to give it to Michael," she says. "He even proposed after he forgave me for cheating." Everyone in the group fell quiet. My mom's face became white as I looked at her in utter shock. My father froze after prodding the flames with a stick. My sister muttered, "She just said what?" I was unable to even comprehend it. I questioned her. "You cheated when?" "Oh," she answered with a sly smile. "A few days before we went to the resort. How could you have forgotten?" For me, it was truly unforgettable. My family wasn't laughing, but a few of her pals chuckled uneasily, presumably assuming it was an inside joke. Before I could say anything, my dad simply shook his head, and my mom appeared to be about to cry. "Calm down, it's a joke," Emma remarked, smiling. "All of you are so stiff." "That's not funny, Emma," my dad muttered as he got up. My mother rose softly and returned to the tent. While everyone else nervously attempted to shift the topic, I just sat there paralyzed. I didn't get much sleep that night. I continued mentally reciting what she had said. Was Emma truly like this? Someone who found it amusing to make fun of me in front of our friends and family. I didn't trust myself not to blow out at the time, so I didn't even approach her about it. She pretended nothing had occurred when we arrived home the following day. She even made a joke. "Babe, you're so silent. What's the matter? Have you lost your sense of humor?" For me, it was it. Though I remained silent, I began to really doubt if this was the person I wanted to live out the rest of my days with. Although I was aware that I needed to make a choice, I wasn't yet prepared to do so. Though I knew deep down that this wasn't the case, I continued telling myself that perhaps this was simply a phase and that she was anxious about the wedding or the future. I wasn't sure if I wanted to or could change the fact that the lady I proposed to was no longer the one sitting across from me. I realized there was a problem between Emma and myself after the camping trip. The way she nonchalantly joked about cheating that night over the campfire kept playing over and over in my mind. As if that were the world's funniest thing. Really caught me off guard. Never in my life had I felt so ashamed, particularly in front of my family. Even my sisters muttered, "Are you okay?" in response to my dad's disillusioned silence and my mom's heartbroken expression. My memory of us is etched in stone. The worst thing, though? Emma seemed really unconcerned. I was still furious by the time we arrived home. I waited for a response from her. An acknowledgement, an apology, anything. However, she pretended that nothing had occurred. As if it were any other day, she dropped her suitcase onto the couch, removed her engagement ring, and placed it on the table. She then proceeded to shower. That was it. No. Hey, I believe I went too far with that joke, or even a basic one. Are you all right? I gazed at the ring while I sat there. I had meticulously chosen it, prepared the proposal, and dreamed about our future together for months. Then it seemed like a cheap piece of jewelry on a table once more. I had lost all of the joy and affection I had experienced when she originally put it on her finger. I chose to take a chance as she emerged from the shower. Hey, about what you said last night at the campfire. Oh my God, Michael, are you really still upset about that? She replied, rolling her eyes before I could finish. It was only a joke. Really, you should relax. That was a huge blow to me. She couldn't even believe that I had been humiliated in front of both of our families. It wasn't humorous, I said. You made me appear like a total moron, Emma. It's overreaction, she remarked, shrugging. It was a joke, as everyone knew. Then, leaving me sitting there with my fury boiling, she took her phone and went into the bedroom. I was no longer able to do it. This was more than one poor joke, I realized. Respect was at issue here. Emma obviously didn't respect me either. How could I be married to someone who felt it was acceptable to make fun of me in every joke? Someone who knew she had harmed me yet was unable to even offer an apology. I had been trying to convince myself that her remarks weren't a huge deal for weeks. However, it was significant. It was quite important. So while she was in the bedroom looking through her phone, I decided what to do. I packed a suitcase, took the engagement ring off the table, and walked out. I went to my buddy Jake's house to crash. Jake is the type of person who has always supported me through thick and thin. He didn't even ask questions when I arrived at his door with a duffel bag and a furious expression on my face. "Come in," he said. "Coffee or beer?" I texted Emma later that evening. I informed her that I wanted time to consider our relationship and that the wedding was off. I didn't sugarcoat anything, but I did my best to remain composed and courteous. I told her that I couldn't marry someone who didn't respect me, and that what she did was wrong. She responded very instantly. "You're really calling it quits on our engagement because of a joke, Michael. You're acting far too emotionally." I looked at the message, utterly perplexed. Feeling sensitive? I wasn't acting sentimentally. I was defending my own interests. "Jokes have their limitations, Emma," I said. "You didn't say anything amusing. It was painful, and you made me seem foolish in front of everyone." When she did answer, it was not immediately. There was no apology. Rather, she wrote, "So what? Are you simply being theatrical and angry, or are you ending our relationship?" I placed my phone down and tried to concentrate on the TV since I didn't have the energy to dispute with her any longer. At last, Jake, who was seated next me, said, "All right, man, what's going on?" I filled him in on everything, including the event at the campfire and the small jest she had been making. "Dude, that's messed up," remarked Jake, who is often the most laid-back person in the world. "It's a warning sign if she's unable to understand your grievance. You're worthy of better." Emma phoned the following morning. She began shrieking as soon as I replied, even though I was half sleeping. "Michael, where's my ring? You were not entitled to accept it. I own it." Emma, I couldn't contain my laughter. The ring stood for both our future together and my affection. Because now both of those are in doubt, it is no longer yours. That response didn't sit well with her. She spat, "You're such a cheapskate." Who of guys returns an engagement ring? I'd had enough of being kind. The type of man who understands that proposing to someone who doesn't appreciate him was a mistake. I fired back. Then she hung up the phone. However, I was aware that this was not the end. I had hoped that things would calm down once the wedding was called off, but I couldn't have been more mistaken. Emma wasn't going to take this lying down. The argument was a full-fledged public theatrical eruption rather than a civil adult discourse. The speed with which she used social media as a weapon to make this into a circus caught me off guard. I received hundreds of texts from friends and relatives the day after I moved out. Emma posted something on Facebook that morning, and my sister Sarah forwarded me a copy of it. She portrayed herself as the victim of my irrational actions in a lengthy, dramatic article. "I can't believe I'm having to go through this," was the post title. I believed my fiancé loved me, but after I made one joke, he snatched back the engagement ring and called off our wedding. He can't take a strong, self-assured lady since he's so sensitive and insecure. I suppose I'm better off knowing now than after I was married to him. Numerous remarks from her pals energizing her were underneath. "Queen, you deserve better. To that loser, goodbye. Additionally, he isn't a man enough for you if he can't handle a joke." It enraged me. The narrative had been misrepresented by her, and suddenly half of our social circle thought I was the evil guy. Her mother phoned me after the awful Facebook post. Although she first spoke in a calm tone, I could see she wasn't happy. "I just want to know what happened, Michael," she added. "Emma informed us that you canceled the wedding due to her foolish joke. Don't you think this is all a little too extreme? I don't want to pick sides." I inhaled deeply and told her what was going on. It wasn't just one joke, I told her. It talked about how the campfire event was the last straw after months of disrespect and ongoing humiliation. I could see her mother didn't really understand, even though she listened quietly. "You know how Emma is, Michael?" she continued asking. Her sense of humor is light-hearted. She had no malicious intent. Lastly, I remarked, "This isn't about her sense of humor, Mrs. Taylor, with all due respect. It has to do with her lack of regard for me and our relationship. Someone who treats me like a joke is not someone I can marry." For a brief moment, that appeared to silence her. Emma's father called a few hours later. He was far more direct. "Michael, you need to put things right. I'm not sure what's going on between you and Emma. She is inconsolable, and it's beginning to look really awful for you both. Just say you're sorry and try to resolve things." What I was hearing was unbelievable. "Figure it out," I said. "Did she tell you what she said around the campfire in front of everyone? She has been treating me disrespectfully for months. Did she say that?" With a sigh, he said. "It was a joke," she said. "Michael, this is being exaggerated by you." It dawned on me then that Emma had likely been giving her family a very different account of what had happened. I apologized to him, but I refused to apologize for defending myself. Taking this lightly is not an option. Emma wasn't content to just drag me around on Facebook. In an attempt to turn our shared acquaintances against me, she began contacting them. Some of my more casual acquaintances began contacting me, wondering, "What's going on, man?" Well, some of my close friends like Jake saw straight through it and supported me. "You freaked out over nothing," Emma says. My explanations were brief and direct since I didn't want to argue with her via our friends. Due to persistent disrespect, I decided to call off the wedding. It's as simple as that. While some attempted to mediate the conflict, the majority simply left it at that. "Are you certain you don't want to simply talk things out, dude? Perhaps you can resolve this." In actuality, I had already decided what I wanted to do. I no longer trusted Emma, and no amount of talking it out would make it any different. The relationship was over. I couldn't marry someone who felt it was acceptable to make fun of me in front of our friends and family, and then act even more aggressively when I attempted to show my hurt. Emma wasn't finished yet, of course. She texted me about the engagement ring once more a few days later. She wasn't simply upset this time. She was threatening to take legal action. "Michael," she wrote, "you can't just take the ring. Legally, it belongs to me. If you don't return it, I'll need to consult a lawyer." When I read that legally hers, I couldn't help but chuckle. "Engagement rings don't operate that way," I answered. "Our engagement was symbolized by the ring. The ring is no longer yours because the engagement is off. You are welcome to seek legal advice." She appeared to lose it after that. After I stole the ring, she returned to social media and shared another statement, saying she was going to fight for what was properly hers. I blocked her on everything by now, but Sarah kept me informed. Sarah sent me another screenshot and remarked, "She's really insane." It was a lengthy tirade about how I was being financially abusive by returning the ring. financially abusive. Throughout all of this, I couldn't believe it. Family was my pillar of support. Every day, my mother called to see how I was doing and to reassure me that I was acting morally. Instead of someone who brings you down, Michael, you deserve someone who makes you feel better. My dad, who isn't the most sentimental, even told me that you made a difficult decision, but it was the correct one, she remarked. Respect is the foundation of marriage. Emma doesn't seem to get it either. Even my sister, who had always had some doubts about Emma, offered encouragement. To be honest, I'm relieved that this occurred now rather than after the wedding. Imagine spending the rest of your life putting up with this type of conduct. It made all the difference to hear that from those closest to me. It served as a reminder that I wasn't going crazy or exaggerating. I was defending my own interests. Furthermore, I shouldn't feel bad about that. I was even more certain of my choice at the conclusion of the week. However, the pain persisted. I believed that I would live out the rest of my days with this woman. I had imagined her marriage and their children growing up together, but suddenly it was all gone. Even when you know it's for the best, it can be difficult to let go of something you've loved and dedicated a lot of time to. Meanwhile, Emma continued to escalate. Mutual acquaintances informed me that she intended to fabricate a tale about how I had abused her during our relationship in order to expose me. I had stopped caring by now. Let her express herself how she pleases. Both I and the individuals who were most important to me were aware of the reality. I assumed Emma would have settled down by the second week following the split. Rather, she chose to intensify her efforts to paint me as the antagonist. She continued to escalate between her social media posts, her family's persistent attempts to shame me into making amends, and her more irrational charges, even though I had already blocked her on all platforms. I knew I couldn't get out of this quietly. She first made an attempt to get in touch with my parents. My mother contacted me one evening and seemed quite distressed. Michael, today, Emma gave me a call. She claimed to have been weeping as she stated, "You're being unfair," adding that she didn't want to upset you and that by putting off the wedding you were ruining both of your lives. I stroked my temples and moaned. What were you saying? I informed her that I supported her and that it was up to her to decide. My mother answered, but she was adamant, Michael. She insisted that you stop allowing your pride to get in the way, that it was only a joke, and that you were overreacting. Mom, she's attempting to control you, I replied. She is aware that I will not give up. And now she's using you to make me feel bad? My mother concurred, but I could see she was troubled by the whole situation. Despite my mother's support for me, I knew that Emma's sob tale had affected her since she was always excellent at playing the victim. Emma continued to accompany my mother. Then she phoned my father. The last person on the planet who would fall for Emma's antics is now my dad. He is straightforward and has never been one to sugarcoat anything. He sounded more irritated than anything else when he phoned me. That girl phoned me today, Michael. He said that she was weeping since the wedding and the ring were off. I assured her, Emma, that Michael had good grounds to stop things. I'm not getting involved either. Regards, Dad. With relief, I said. After that, what did she say? She went on to say that she didn't mean it. She's devastated and you're too sensitive, I informed her. You're going in the wrong direction, Emma. My kid was insulted by you, and I don't hold it against him for leaving. That quickly silenced her. I was relieved to hear that, but I detested her attempts to include my family in this. She had already alienated half of our shared acquaintances, but now she was using my own parents as leverage to get me to forgive her. Now, if you haven't already, I just want to remind you to click the subscribe button before we get into the last update. It really benefits the channel and enables us to continue providing you with more incredible tales. Okay, let's go on to the last update. The last update. Laura, one of our common friends, contacted me and said, "Hey Michael, I thought you should know. Emma has been accusing you of being jealous and domineering in your relationship." What? Completely floored, I said. From where is this coming? She claims that you forbade her from talking to other men or hanging out with her friends. Laura clarified. I am aware that it is untrue. I wanted to let you know what she's saying, but I've seen how much freedom you granted her. I wasn't really shocked, but I was angry. Emma had always been adept at fabricating tales to support her innocence. I assumed this was her attempt to explain the split to others who were unaware of the whole situation. It still stung. Even when her conduct began to cross limits, I made an effort to give her space and encourage her friendships, so it was a smack in the face for her to accuse me of being overbearing. That's when my best friend Jake came in. In response to Emma's tirades on social media, he began sharing little bits of the truth. Just gentle reminders that every story has two sides, nothing combative. For instance, Jake remarked that engagement rings are actually conditional presents when Emma shared a photo of how I had stolen her ring. The ring is returned to the donor in the event that the engagement is broken. Just letting you know. Although it wasn't much, it was plenty to get people to stop and consider Emma's story. Emma unexpectedly arrived to Jake's house a week later. She must have figured out where I was because I was living there temporarily while I worked things out. When I answered the door after she knocked, she burst into tears. "Please, Michael." Her voice trembled as she said, "Can we have a conversation? Only for a few minutes? Do you want me to throw her out?" Jake, who had been seated on the couch, looked at me. I gave a head shake, even though I didn't want to speak with her. This could be the only way to persuade her to quit, I thought. As soon as we sat down at the kitchen table, Emma began to talk passionately about how much she loved me, how sorry she was, and how she was unaware of how much her jokes had wounded me. "I just wanted people to laugh," she stated. "I didn't intend to offend you. I would never truly cheat on you, you know." I listened to her for a bit, but I interrupted her when she began accusing me of overreacting once more. "Stop, Emma. Jokes have their limitations, notwithstanding your insistence that it was only a joke. After you went too far, you doubled down and pretended that I was the issue rather than offering an apology. If someone doesn't appreciate me, how can I marry them?" After that, she stopped crying really fast. "So that's it," she remarked, taking a smell. "You're simply discarding 3 years of work because of one poor joke." I added, "Emma, it's not just one joke. It's the consistent humiliation, the disrespectful behavior, and the repeated indications that you don't value our relationship or me. I am no longer able to do this." Then she got up and said, "Well, if that's how you feel, then I guess I wasted 3 years of my life." She had been staring at me then. She slammed the door behind her as she ran out. "Well, that was something," Jake replied, glancing at me. "Are you all right?" "Yes, remarkably composed," I said. "I'm finished. I've begun to feel like myself again after that last encounter. Even though it hurt at first, removing Emma from my life was the finest choice I've ever made. In addition to my family's tremendous support, I've come to understand who my actual friends are. People who supported Emma have begun to get in touch, claiming they were unaware of the whole situation. I'm still not sure if I want to make the effort to get back in touch with them. I quote, "Em simply focused on getting ahead for the time being." To the best of my knowledge, Emma continues to share her version of events with anybody who will listen. However, I no longer give a damn. Let her express herself how she pleases. I am aware of the reality, and those who are important to me are also aware of it. Ultimately, I'm simply relieved that I discovered her true identity before it was too late. Read it then. Am I the jerk? Story 3. This narrative has a title. After losing my parents, my brothers abandoned me in foster care. 10 years later, they seek my aid. Halalo everyone. Remember to click the subscribe button if you like these stories and would like to help the channel. It's absolutely free, takes only a second, and helps me bring you even more fantastic material like this. Let's begin the video now. OP opens by saying, "When I was 10, my mom passed away. It was abrupt, and there wasn't much time to understand what was happening. One day she was there, and the next she wasn't. It was an automobile accident. I recall sitting in the waiting area at the hospital while the nurses chatted in low tones. My brothers Kevin and David were both present, but they didn't appear as scared as I was. Maybe it was because they were older. Or maybe it was because they had already started distancing away from our family by then. David, 19, was beginning college, while Kevin, 23, was occupied with his new work. When I was a child, all of my knowledge of security and family vanished in an instant. I thought my brothers would take the lead during the burial. They were adults after all. David was living in a dorm with a few pals, whereas Kevin had his own apartment. When I heard them discussing preparations, I assumed that one of them would take me in, or at least offer to. I found out then that I would not be staying with one of them. It was confirmed by the social worker who arrived the next week. I could only think about the fact that my brothers didn't want me, even if she was a decent person. Of course they made excuses. Kevin said he was not prepared to take on the role of full-time guardian. David said he couldn't balance being a parent and going to school. At the time, I was at a loss for words. I was a terrified little boy who had lost his mother. But it was clear from the way they spoke to me that they avoided making eye contact. That was a duty they had no interest in accepting. Without any ceremony, I was thrown into the foster care system. Kevin gave me a shoulder pat, signed some paperwork, and promised to come over. In case you missed it, he didn't. Foster care was a complex situation. Although it took some time, I ultimately found a respectable house. I was originally placed with a family that viewed me as a source of income. They were far away, but they didn't touch me or anything. On-time meal service was provided. The home seemed chilly all the time, even though the refrigerator was loaded. I didn't speak to my foster parents until absolutely must. Additionally, their 2 older children made it apparent that I was not a member of their little family. Sitting in my room with my mom's old picture book. I was alone myself most of the time. It was among the few items I had successfully brought with me. A few months after my placement, the phone calls began. I was first thrilled to hear from David and Kevin. I hoped they would reconsider their choice since they felt bad about it. The calls, however, were uncomfortable. They would pose general inquiries. How is school going? Do you eat enough? There would then be extended silences. They never paid any attention to my responses. I eventually stopped anticipating their calls. They didn't seem to be acting out of genuine concern, but rather out of duty. When I was 12 years old, I had the audacity to ask Kevin why he hadn't taken me in. I was just starting my career, man, he groaned, as if I were being ridiculous. The moment wasn't appropriate. When I questioned David, he offered a similar justification. I didn't know how to bring up a child. Oh, he said. Neither of us would have been treated fairly. Their remarks stayed with me even though I didn't know how to respond at the moment. Fairness wasn't the issue. It had to do with their lack of desire for me. As the years passed, I discovered that I shouldn't hold my family to high standards. The frequency of calls decreased from once a month to a few times annually. I gave them brief responses to their inquiries and gave up on attempting to interact with them. Yes, it's fine in school. No comma, nothing is necessary for me. I suppose I'm grateful you called. They eventually stopped phoning completely, and I didn't mind. I detested them by the time I was 15, each and every one. My uncles, aunts, and brothers, they were all alike. When it counted, they showed no concern for me. Why should I give a damn about them then? However, the foster home I was placed with at the age of 14 was superior. They made an effort, but they weren't flawless. Mr. Clark treated me like one of his own children, and my foster mother, Mrs. Clark, was kind. They didn't treat me like an outsider, even though we weren't really close. They had 2 younger children. It was the first time in years that I felt somewhat stable. I'm appreciative of everything they done for me, and I stayed with them until I became 18. Even yet, I was unable to get rid of my resentment toward my own family. I would question why no one had stood up for me on every birthday and holiday. Why was I not considered valuable by anyone? I made the decision to stop when I was 20. My brothers had called me a few times, but I had not returned their calls. I wasn't interested in their reasons or their apologies. I was sick of being the child they left behind. So, without telling anybody where I was going, I packed my stuff and left town. I left no note at all. I desired a new beginning, a life free from the actions or inactions of my family. Although it wasn't simple, it was worthwhile to start over. I found work, relocated to a new city, and began establishing a new life for myself. I kept my whole tale to myself. I would just respond, "We're not close," and move on when someone inquired about my family. That was simpler. I spent years feeling inadequate, and no one needed to know about it. In retrospect, I'm not sure whether I'll ever be able to forgive my brothers. Perhaps they believed they were acting appropriately, or perhaps they were self-centered. In any case, I made my decision and they made theirs. All I knew was that I would no longer let their disregard to define who I was. I felt like I was in charge of my own life for the first time in years, and that was sufficient for me. It was both liberating and scary to start again at the age of 20. I took a bus to a city I had only ever seen on TV, after packing everything I owned into a battered duffel bag. The idea was that I didn't know anyone there. I want a new beginning in which I would no longer be recognized as the abandoned child. I just had enough money to last me a few weeks, no real strategy, and the hazy notion that I would work things out as I went. The initial months were difficult. While I was looking for a job, I lived in a budget hostel, maximizing every money and consuming quick noodles on a daily basis. To keep the lights on, I would take on odd jobs like cleaning offices, unloading trucks, and dishwashing. I had trouble sleeping, partially because I kept wondering if I had made the correct decision, but also because the hostel was noisy. Was it foolish to sever all connections and begin anew? However, each time I considered contacting my brothers, I would recall those uncomfortable phone conversations, the justifications, and how they failed me when I most needed them. That was plenty to keep me going. After a while, everything began to make sense. I got a job at a little coffee shop where the regulars crumpled and tipped dollar notes and knew your name. Although the compensation wasn't spectacular, work was consistent, and Mrs. Patel, the owner, liked me. She made me think of my last foster mother, Mrs. Clark. No nonsense, but kind. I secretly enjoyed her nagging me to eat more veggies and to keep out of trouble. Nobody has cared enough to accomplish it in a long time. I had not felt stable in years until I started working at the coffee shop. Some of the regulars, like Lisa, a student who was often here with her nose in a textbook, and Alex, who owned the bookshop next door, became friends with me. It was the first time in ages. I had a sense of belonging. I didn't provide any information, and no one inquired about my history. They just recognized me as the guy who always had a joke ready and made a fantastic latte. It was sufficient. Things improved much more around age 22. I met Sarah at that point. One gloomy afternoon, she entered the coffee shop. She appeared to have had the worst day ever, completely soaked. She stopped to order a chai latte, even though her umbrella was broken and she was rushing late for a meeting. She grinned and remarked, "Thanks for not judging me for looking like a drowned rat," as I gave it to her. "Hey, you're the best-dressed drowned rat I've seen all day," I remarked, laughing. I could tell she was amused even if she rolled her eyes. After that, Sarah began to visit more frequently. Before long, we were conversing each time she visited. She was a graphic artist, a bit older than me at 30. She exuded a certain effortless assurance, as if she didn't care what other people thought of her and knew exactly who she was. I'd spent so much of my life feeling like I had to prove myself to people who didn't care anyhow, so it was refreshing. I finally plucked up the courage to ask her out after a few weeks. She answered yes, which surprised me. It was a straightforward first date. We strolled into the park after grabbing burgers from a food vendor. We spent hours discussing everything and nothing. As an only kid with loving parents, she told me about her early years and how she had always wanted to see the globe. I told her that I worked at the coffee shop and that I wanted to create my own business someday. But I didn't share anything about my family with her. I simply stated that we weren't close and didn't elaborate. I liked that Sarah didn't press for specifics. At least initially, she appeared to appreciate my decision to wait until I was ready to discuss it. Our romance progressed swiftly. After a year of dating, we were considering moving in together. Sarah's house was nicer, but I had saved up enough money to move out of the hostel and into a small apartment. In the end, I moved in with her. At first it felt weird. Being in the company of someone who was very close to their family, she would tell her folks everything when they called to talk every few days, what we watched and what we ate for supper. Including minor things like the new coffee place we tried. I wasn't accustomed to such transparency. I always had a tendency to keep things to myself. But Sarah was patient with me. Her parents went out of their way to make me feel welcome, even though I first felt like an outsider when she invited me to family meals and holidays. Her mom always produced enough food to feed an army, and her dad was the type of person who could talk to everyone. It was pleasant, but it also gave me a strange feeling, as if I were seeing something I had never seen before, and most likely would never again. Sarah eventually began bringing up the subject of getting back in touch with my family. Wouldn't it be pleasant to have them back in your life? She inquired. We were having supper one evening when I froze my fork in mid-mouth. Not really, I said. She seems taken aback. But, she continued, they're your family. As if that had any significance. She dropped it when I told her I didn't want to discuss it. At least I believed she did. In hindsight, I believe Sarah sincerely thought she was assisting. I don't believe she could comprehend why someone would choose to sever ties with their own blood when she was raised in such a close-knit, encouraging household. Her family meant the world to her. However, family served as a constant reminder of all the times I had been disappointed. Everything was going well. I thought Sarah had fully grasped my point of view when she ceased bringing up my relatives. We began discussing our future marriage, having children, and perhaps even purchasing a home in the future. We seemed to be constructing something sturdy, something I could trust. For the first time, I believed that I could have finally found my happily ever after. However, I would soon discover that not everything is as solid as it first appears. A text message was the first thing sent. I nearly disregarded the call since I didn't recognize it. However, my curiosity overcame me, and I opened it. It was something like, "Hey, it's been a long time," in the message. I realize this is unexpected, but I would really like to catch up. I froze when I saw the name at the bottom. My eldest brother is Kevin. I initially assumed it had to be spam or some other error. Surely, after all these years, Kevin wouldn't get in touch. He obviously knew precisely who he was speaking to, though, as I read the message again. There were some things he said that only my brother would be aware of. Information about our mother and the area and where we were raised. I felt sick to my stomach. He got my number, but how? I debated whether or not to reply as I looked at the message for a while. A part of me wanted to yell and call him, while another part of me wanted to hurl my phone across the room. However, I didn't do either in the end. I just blocked the number. That should be the end of it, I thought. No, it wasn't. I told Sarah about it later that evening. "You'll be shocked to learn who texted me today," I remarked, attempting to seem informal. She raised her head from her computer, wondering. "Who?" "Kevin, my sibling," I said. I didn't anticipate her response. She gave me this strange, guilty face instead of one of surprise or worry. "Oh," she muttered. "That was what I was going to tell you." I went cold. "Tell me what?" I learned everything I needed to know from her hesitancy. She confessed. "I gave him your number." The floor seemed to fall out from under me. "What are you?" I simply assumed she had begun, but I interrupted her. "What did you think? I wouldn't be aware of it? I told you about my family, and it was acceptable to disregard all of it. I reasoned that perhaps if you spoke with him, you would discover it's not as horrible as you believe." Her tone was defensive as she spoke. "I just wanted to help you get over the anger you've been harboring for so long. Assist me, I lost my temper. Are you aware of what you have done? You were not entitled." She flinched. I didn't care, though. I was shocked that she had done this behind my back, particularly considering how often I expressed my feelings to her over my family. I believed she comprehended. She seemed to respect my limits. Obviously, I was mistaken. She made an effort to clarify that she didn't mean any harm and that she just wanted to assist. I didn't care what her goals were, though. I couldn't ignore the fact that she had crossed a line. This is not something I can accomplish. Finally, I told her, "We're finished." Her gaze expanded. "Is this the reason you're ending our relationship?" I said, "It's not just this. It's because you don't respect me enough to pay attention. Even though I expressed my feelings to you, you chose to ignore me. Someone who believes they know more about my life than I do is not someone I can be with." I became even more irate when she began to weep. She cried, "I'm sorry. I had no intention of hurting you. Let's talk about this, please. We are able to repair it." However, I was tired of talking. I had stated what I had to say. "You must leave. Take as much time as you need, but I want you to go," I informed her. She sobbed more, pleading with me to change my mind, but I had already made up my mind. In a partnership, trust is vital, and there's no turning back once it's shattered. Not for me, anyhow. The days that followed were a haze. One box at a time, Sarah packed up her belongings and left our flat. While she was packing, I made an effort to stay away. I knew I had done the right thing, but it was too hard to witness. To make matters worse, her folks began phoning me. Sarah was sad and didn't understand why I was being so harsh, they said in message after voicemail. They maintained that she didn't deserve to be penalized for a single error because she had good intentions. There was more than one error, though. It was a breach of confidence, and there was no use in attempting to convey it if they were unable to comprehend it. I also blocked their phones. A week or so after Sarah moved out, I sat on the couch one evening and gazed at the empty spot where her bookcase had been. Anger was one of the strange sensations I experienced. Sadness, relief. A part of me was relieved she was gone, but another part of me missed her. I couldn't get rid of the thought that this split was unavoidable, and that her and my conceptions of family will eventually conflict. In hindsight, I believe Sarah sincerely thought she was assisting me. She didn't realize that some things don't require repair, even if she believed she was repairing something that was damaged. It quotes preferable to leave certain things alone. I didn't require my brother's forgiveness. I didn't have to have a heart-to-heart or forgive them. I just wanted the calm that comes with being in charge of my own life. That was invisible to Sarah, and that's what ultimately caused us to drift apart. I assumed that when Sarah moved out, everything would calm down. I was mistaken. The drama, if anything, just got more intense. I banned Sarah's parents' numbers, but they continued to attempt to get involved. They managed to reach me with texts. They once appeared when I was working at the coffee shop. I was unaware of their arrival until Mrs. Patel informed me from the rear. "A pair is requesting you. They appear to be distressed." My heart fell. I recognized the person already. Sarah's parents seemed as though they had just stepped off a suburban family postcard as I came out to the front. Her dad appeared prepared to reprimand me, and her mother was crying. "All we want to do is chat." As soon as he spotted me, her father remarked. I let out a sigh. "I work. It's not the right time or location. You haven't really given us a lot of options." Her mother spoke in a shaky voice. "Sarah is heartbroken that our numbers have been restricted." "You're not even going to listen to her. Nothing can be heard," I said, attempting to seem calm. "She betrayed my confidence. The narrative is over." Her father came forward in an obvious attempt to scare me. "How much has she been sobbing? Do you know?" "Although she made a mistake, it wasn't malicious. She is concerned about you. She was only attempting to assist." I inhaled deeply while attempting to suppress the roil of annoyance that was rising inside me. "See, I apologized for her pain, but it doesn't make up for what transpired. She disregarded my explicit boundaries. I can't simply go on from it. But for one episode, you're discarding years of a relationship," her mother said, now practically begging. "You know she's in treatment. She is attempting to comprehend the reasons for her actions. That means something to you, doesn't it?" "It doesn't alter her actions," I answered. "I want you to go now. I'm going to stop talking about this. Mrs. Patel must have noticed the tension because she emerged from the rear and instructed them to go, forcefully, but softly. I was glad she had my back, but I felt horrible that she had to get involved. Her father grumbled something about my being ungrateful and frigid as they were leaving. I simply shook my head and resumed my job. However, that was not the end of it. I began receiving letters from Sarah herself. I first disregarded them. The first few I didn't even open, simply throw them in the garbage. But I opened one day because I was so curious. She expressed her regret for her actions once more in the letter. She claimed she wished she could take it back and regretted going too far. However, she also reaffirmed her position, stating that she still thought I had to face my history. She wrote, "I just wanted you to have the opportunity to heal. I had no intention of hurting you. I was attempting to assist." I was more irate than I had anticipated after reading the letter. She wasn't saying she was sorry. The way she continued to frame it, as like she understood more about my life than I did, was problematic. Even though that portion was acceptable, that infuriated me. She failed to see that what I needed was quite different from her idea of assistance. I didn't reply to her correspondence. I failed to see the purpose. It was obvious that we would never agree on this, and delaying it would only make matters worse. I concentrated on my work and re-establishing my schedule without her. It was easier on some days than others. I would occasionally consider phoning or messaging her to check on her. However, I was aware. It is almost tough to restore confidence after it has been damaged. My brothers began making more frequent attempts to get in touch with me about this time. It had not been sufficient to block Kevin's phone. They also discovered me on social media. Years have passed since I erased my accounts, but it appears that Kevin had enlisted David, who had not yet been barred. He sent me a message that simply stated, "We need to talk." The message stuck in my thoughts for days, even after I erased it without responding. What were they seeking? Why now? I kept thinking that Sarah had opened a door with her interference. I had been trying hard to stay closed. Even though I knew I was now the one dealing with everything, it made me detest her once again. I finally made the decision to send David one final message. It was succinct and direct. "I have no desire to converse. Please don't get in touch with me." As soon as I sent it, I blocked him. That should be the end of it, I thought. Once more, I was mistaken. I was sitting in my flat one evening when there was a knock on the door. I hesitated before opening it, because I wasn't expecting anyone. I was shocked to see Kevin standing there when I eventually did. "Why are you here?" With a chilly tone, I inquired. "All I want to do is chat." With his hands up as if in submission, he spoke. "May I enter?" "No," I responded bluntly. "You may say anything you want to say here." Despite his surprised expression, he nodded. "Look, I understand that you're upset with David and me. When Mom passed away, we ought to have done more. We made a mistake. However, you continue to ignore us despite our efforts to set things right." I folded my arms. "You have a decade to correct it. Why now?" He paused. "We had no idea how to get in touch with you." Sarah then made contact. Her account of what transpired caused us to reflect. All we want is an opportunity to make things right. It was like a kick to the belly when he said her name. Sarah was not entitled to become engaged. I clenched my teeth and said, "Furthermore, you have no right to arrive here without permission. I've stated it clearly. I'd rather not speak with you." I didn't care that Kevin's face plummeted. "I apologize." Silently he said, "For everything. My little brother is missed. Before you left him, you need to have considered it," I said. I closed the door in his face after that. I had trouble sleeping that night. It brought back memories to see Kevin. I had made an effort to forget that I had been a lonely, afraid child. Why didn't anyone want him? I was reminded of why I had severed my relationship in the first place. Not everyone deserves a second shot. I knew I needed to alter once Kevin arrived at my home. Ignoring messages and blocking numbers was no longer sufficient. My relatives had a knack of re-entering the picture, regardless of how explicit I was, that I had no desire to interact with them. I had the impression that I was always watching over my shoulder, anticipating the next message or door knock. I detested having that feeling, as if I didn't have complete power over my life. My initial action was to speak with my landlord. I gave a brief explanation of the circumstances and inquired as to whether I might end my lease early. He wasn't happy, but he accepted when I offered to pay a month's rent as a fine. I quickly began searching for a new location, concentrating on areas further away from Kevin's potential search area. I located a modest studio apartment on the opposite side of town within a week. I had it, even if it wasn't much. Above all else, it was a new beginning. It was heartbreaking to pack up my former home. Even though I really wanted to go, after foster care, this flat had been my first actual residence. I had begun reassembling my life there, piece by piece. After thinking for a time that I might finally have something steady, I met Sarah there. I felt as though I was leaving behind a phase of my life that had been both traumatic and, in its own way, optimistic. I was surprised by how much the move helped. I had a sense of freedom that I hadn't experienced in a long time because I was in a new location with fresh surroundings. It felt like I could breathe again for the first time in weeks. I poured myself into my profession, taking on extra coffee shop shifts and accumulating savings for the future. One day, Mrs. Patel drew me aside after noticing that I was working harder than usual. "Are you all right?" With worried eyes, she inquired. "Yes." I forced a grin as I said, simply staying occupied. I could sense she didn't trust me completely, but she didn't press. Her generosity meant a lot, though. It served as a reminder that relationships don't always have to be difficult or unpleasant. Some just cared because they felt compelled to. There are no conditions. Naturally, Sarah didn't give up immediately. She continued to send me letters to my new address, even after I moved. It was pointless for me to open them. I was aware that nothing she said would alter the situation. I had already made up my mind, and I had no intention of changing it. I kept reminding myself that trust is the cornerstone of all relationships, and that once it is lost, it cannot be regained. but it was difficult. On certain evenings I would lie awake reflecting on our enjoyable times together, and questioning whether I had been too severe. However, I knew in my heart that I hadn't. Her actions weren't only an error, it was a basic disrespect for my needs and identity. After Kevin's visit, I didn't hear from my brothers again. If they were simply waiting for the ideal opportunity to attempt again, or if they had finally received the message, I had no idea. To be honest, I didn't give a damn. I became increasingly aware of how much lighter I felt without them in my life as time went on. I was no longer harboring that bitterness and rage. I had finally come to terms with the fact that I didn't need them, not because I had forgiven them. Their guilt trips, their opinions, their efforts to get back in touch. It didn't matter. I had had enough of them controlling me. An old acquaintance I hadn't spoken to in years sent me an email one day, perhaps 6 months after Sarah and I split up. I had known this person while I was in foster care, Marcus, a man. After he aged out of the system, we lost contact even though he was a few years older than me. It was unexpected, but wonderful to see his name in my email. Marcus stated in his email that he was a technician who had recently relocated to my city. He asked if I wanted to meet up and have coffee someday. At first I was hesitant. It felt dangerous to let someone from my past back into my life, especially in light of all that had transpired. Marcus, however, was not like Sarah or my brothers. He was aware of what it was like to grow up without a safety net and to feel as though you had to fend for yourself. I then responded and scheduled a meeting time. Reuniting with Marcus was like entering a world I had nearly forgotten. We laughed over the foolish things we did as children and told stories about our foster families for hours on end. He told me how he had finally found steady employment after aging out and the difficulties he had faced. I informed him of my work at the coffee shop and my aspirations to create my own business someday. Marcus once commented, "You've done good for yourself, man," leaning back in his chair. "You have my admiration." I was surprised by it. Hearing it from someone who was aware of the more sinister aspects of my background was something I wasn't used to. However, it meant far more than I could express. Marcus and I re-established our strong friendship over the course of the following few months. It was revolutionary to have someone who was aware of my background without passing judgment or attempting to alter me. Family isn't always about blood, he reminded me. It's about the individuals who support you when it matters most. Marcus encouraged me to start considering my future carefully. Even though I wasn't quite ready to operate my own coffee shop, the ambition didn't seem as far as it once did after years of saving money. I felt as though I was creating something genuine and wholly mine for the first time in a long time. In retrospect, severing my relationship with Sarah and my brothers was one of the most difficult choices I've ever had to make. It was among the finest, though. It taught me the value of setting limits, defending my needs, and refusing to allow guilt pressure me into sacrificing them. Despite the fact that my decisions were unpleasant, I don't regret them. They helped me get to this point, where I can now at last begin to go forward. I don't need my family in my life, but I do wish them well. I've discovered that it's acceptable when a relationship isn't worth preserving. A happy ending is not necessary for every narrative. Walking away and concentrating on creating the life you deserve is sometimes the wisest course of action.